Welcome to a new episode of TTG Conversations 5 Questions video series. I'm Karen Yue, Group Editor of TTG Asia Media. In this episode, we will look at Asia Pacific's move towards international travel resumption and the impact this is having on airlines and travel recovery. Taking us through this topic is Brendan Sobie, analyst and consultant with Singapore-based Sobie Aviation. Brendan has been working in the aviation industry for over 20 years as a writer, analyst, and consultant. He served as Chief Analyst for Kappa Center of Aviation from 2011 to 2019 and was editor for Flight Global from year 2000 to 2011. Brendan provides strategic advice for a wide range of companies including airports, airlines, development banks, investment banks, and IT suppliers. He is also widely recognized as a thought leader on aviation issues here in this region. Welcome to the show, Brendan.
Thank you, Karen. Thanks for inviting me to participate in today's show.
That's wonderful. I've got 5 questions for you, and here is the first. Now, Asia Pacific region appears to be on a roll now with tourism resumption, with governments from Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Australia showing greater conviction to reopen their domestic or international borders for all travel purposes. TTG Asia has reported on Singapore's vaccinated lanes, Indonesia's reopening of Bali to travelers from certain low-risk countries with shorter quarantine, Malaysia's interstate travel restart, and plans to move into foreign arrivals soon, Thailand as well. How are airlines ramping up in response to these developments?
Yeah, there's certainly been a lot of major developments in the last few weeks, which is kind of what everybody has been hoping for so long, and things are starting to move in the right direction. Airlines, are starting to increase capacity, add flights in response to the anticipated demand as we get towards the year-end holiday season, with the opportunity for so many people to travel again, either from this region or just people from outside this region, the opportunity to visit some of the popular spots again. So there is an anticipated increase in demand, and some airlines are already seeing some of this increase in demand and are responding by added capacity. But it does vary by market, not only because some markets are opening up faster than others and have more, I would say, demand or at this point than others, but also it depends on what airlines have been doing, so far during the pandemic. So some airlines, for example, like Qantas in Australia, was not operating any scheduled international flights, with the exception of a few from Australia. So when the announcement came that they're opening the borders again with New South Wales and Victoria starting from 1st of November, even though it's only outbound traffic, there's no visitors allowed for now in its initial phase. They quickly brought forward resumption of international flights to places like, London, Los Angeles, also Singapore. The popular places where Australians have lived and want to come home, or Australians are eager to travel to in this initial phase. So we see a lot of movement from an airline like Qantas because they didn't have anything or had virtually nothing to begin with for many months. But in Singapore, it's a little different because Singapore Airlines, for example, has been operating during this entire period quite a comprehensive schedule actually, and they've been ramping up over the last year. We're already at 30 to 35% of their normal capacity as a group. So for them, it's really about more about filling those empty seats. So Singapore Airlines was had 30 to 35% capacity already, but they only have demand of 5%. So the load factors were below 20%. So a lot of it is about filling that capacity. Now, of course, they have added some flights and upgauged some in response to the vaccinated travel lane, but for them it's more, I would say, about filling in that capacity that they've been operating this whole time. While for somebody like Qantas, it's about adding flights because they were basically in hibernation. So it really depends on the airline, depends on the market. So some airlines really are coming out of what I call hibernation, where they weren't operating international flights for this entire period, at least not passenger flights. Some are operating cargo, obviously, while others, I would say, have been operating, but have an opportunity now to improve their load factors and add maybe select flights on select routes.
Okay, and what challenges are airlines facing now in getting operations back on track?
Yeah, I mean, it's those airlines that have been hibernating, like I was saying, it's more challenging because they have to reactivate aircraft, they have to prepare from a maintenance perspective and from a pilot training perspective. And those airlines that have been operating all along, they've been able to keep a large portion of their fleet hot and a lot of their pilots active just by even though even though they've been utilized a lot less, both the aircraft and the crew, by just using each kind of airplane and each set of crew kind of a minimum amount of time, so maybe like once a week rather than once every other day, or once a week rather than 3 times a week for crew, or for an aircraft maybe a couple times a week rather than every day, that kind of thing. So just about kind of ramping up the utilization. But so a lot of airlines have to do a lot of retraining. I mean, even for Singapore Airlines, for example, even though they kept a lot of the aircraft and crew active, they're bringing back the A380, so that involves getting the 380 pilots back up and running, through simulator training and through these short flights to Kuala Lumpur that will obviously run very empty, but just to try to get the crew back up to speed in ahead of the Sydney and London flights, which we'll resume later with the A380. So there's a lot of that from a kind of operational perspective, and then of course from a commercial perspective, there's a lot of a lot of things to be done to kind of promote the market and promote the resumption, because for so long, really only essential travel was taking place. So there wasn't much marketing, there wasn't much commercial activity. It was, but now you're starting to see that again, because airlines, are trying to, have an opportunity to stimulate demand and try to kind of, get back passenger confidence to travel. So, so there's a lot of marketing and a lot of kind of commercial activities around that to try to get people, confident in flying again, because the situation obviously is not like it was before the pandemic. There's a lot of hassle, quite a lot of stress. There's a lot of paperwork. There's a lot of procedures in terms of, preparing for international travel, as well as once you're on board, of course, there's all these health measures and so forth. So a lot of airlines are kind of working on, finalizing those, although those are a lot in place, but more importantly, communicating to the passenger, what the journey will look like and what they need to do to travel confidently again.
Yeah. Okay. Should these reopening intentions take off successfully without stops and starts, how do you think 2022 would look for regional airlines?
Yeah, I mean, even if there's no setbacks, which is a huge, assumption, because as we've seen before in this crisis, there is often setbacks, and almost surely there will be some setbacks in some markets. But even if there is no setbacks, it's going to be a very gradual recovery from an international perspective. Domestic markets tend to recover quite fast because you don't have the restrictions, you don't have the issues. People are more confident to travel domestically, and once the restrictions in places like Malaysia, lift, the demand comes back quite fast. And we've seen this in other parts of the world already. And now we're starting to see this in Asia as the domestic markets reopen. International is very slow. It's, we're not going to see a large volume of traffic in the initial months, and it's going to take a few years for a full recovery. So the outlook is still very challenging. You have to be airlines have to be very flexible, because the demand, it's hard to predict how quickly the demand will come back. I mean, we know that all international demand won't come back at once, but we don't know, how it will look between now and say a year from now in terms of the ramp up. Will it be, will we get to 50% very quickly, or will it take even a year to get to 50%? Also, destinations, some destinations will be more popular than others in the post-pandemic environment. I think, it's not only about what's open and what's not open, it's also about, what people feel comfortable traveling to. So, airlines will have to be flexible in deploying the capacity to destinations that people want to fly to in this kind of initial post-pandemic environment. And then the other thing is the segment, the mix of traffic is going to change a lot. And this is like business versus leisure. So, business travel might be slower in returning. So airlines will have to adjust by focusing more on leisure routes and and using the aircraft and the configuration that is most appropriate for that kind of segment of the market, rather than business traffic, because that could take a long time to recover. And even within the leisure segment, I think there'll be a lot of differences. I mean, I think VFR, which is visiting friends and relatives, that segment will probably recover fastest, just because people want to see their families again and friends after so long, while kind of the pure leisure segment, particularly the inbound leisure segment for Asia, might be very slow in recovering compared to, say, outbound or compared to VFR. The reason is that to attract people back to this region, particularly from like long-haul markets like Europe and North America will be quite challenging because they have a lot of choices already, and Asia's behind because it's opened a lot slower than those regions. So there's a lot of work that has to be done to kind of entice these people back, and also places like Singapore, they rely on multi-country itineraries, and multi-country itineraries I think are going to be much harder and less common in the post-pandemic environment. The reason is just all the hassle of going through borders and dealing with the testing and all sorts of restrictions every time you go to a new international destination. So I think you'll see kind of a lot of people kind of gravitate towards spending longer in one country or one destination. So it's so that obviously impacts airlines because there'll be less flying around the region, and there'll be there'll be certain destinations that maybe can cater to that kind of segment more than or better than others. So there'll be growth in those destinations, and airlines will have to adjust to add capacity to those kinds of destinations, while maybe not adding back capacity to those destinations that kind of are not very popular in the post-pandemic environment.
That's right. Okay. Do you see post-pandemic travel behaviors and preferences having an impact on how travelers view full service versus low-cost carriers?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people think that low-cost carriers will kind of recover faster, but I don't necessarily see that particularly in Asia. But I mean, that doesn't mean they'll recover slower. I just think it's overall, I think it'll kind of be similar, and it really depends on the market again. Which country in Asia and what kind of segment of the market you're looking at. So, and which airline as well. So a lot of the initial recovery is in the long haul market, and that's because regional is not opening as fast. So those countries that are opening, like Australia and Singapore and Malaysia and Thailand, a lot of the initial traffic will come from the long haul markets, because you have China that's still closed and other regional markets that are still closed. So they're traditional source markets, or the traditional popular destinations from an outbound perspective, are not open, and with the long haul dominating in this initial phase, obviously that actually plays into the hands of the full service airlines, because the low cost carriers are mainly kind of regional operators. But for those markets that there's domestic, of course, the LCCs will do quite well, because LCCs traditionally dominate the domestic markets, and as domestic recovers, they will do well in that space. But in the international space, maybe the full service airlines will have a bit of an advantage because a lot of the demand will be on the long haul routes. So it remains to be seen. The other big factor here is, what airlines are in position to kind of expand or resume their operations faster than others. And a lot of that is about financial strength, about liquidity, about government support. And so a lot of airlines have received a lot of government support. Those airlines tend to be full service airlines. Some of them have LCC subsidiaries. So the LCC subsidiaries kind of benefit from that by default because they're under full service groups. But most of the LCCs are independent LCCs that don't have the government support, and have some financial issues, some liquidity issues. So some of those LCCs might actually be struggle to expand or to get all their aircraft back flying because they just kind of lack the cash to do that. So that's another factor that's kind of not really about demand and what passengers prefer, but it's actually about which airlines are able to respond in this environment given their financial position.
Okay. Now, Singapore's vaccinated travel lane is an improvement on the previous situation where travel was heavily restricted. Now, you have expressed views about how this is not a sustainable option to reboot travel and tourism for the country. Can you tell us why?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously it's a temporary solution. I mean, nobody. I don't think anybody thinks it's permanent, the vaccinated travel lane. It's just kind of a way to get things going. But the question is how long is temporary. And my view is it's and most airlines agree that it's better to kind of move on to a kind of a normal kind of open market system as fast as possible. The reason is the vaccinated travel lane artificially constrains capacity. There's a cap of 3,000 arrivals per day. And then each of the 11 countries has a cap under that. That's unfortunately not published, but in many cases the demand is higher than supply, particularly for peak periods. It really depends on the market. So I like the UK. I think is particularly very popular right now. The reason is that the number of flights and the cap for the UK is a lot less than say the US. and in the UK is actually a larger market from Singapore than the US. So there's that issue, and when you artificially constrain capacity like that, you can have an impact on airfares, because obviously naturally, like those markets that are in high demand, particularly for the peak season, the cheaper seats get bought out quickly, and that only leaves the more expensive seats. That's typical airline revenue management, and you can't fly on non-VTL flights. If you do, you end up in quarantine. Now, of course, Singapore has reduced quarantine, so it's in a lot of cases just 7 days at home. So maybe it's a decent option, but still a lot of people obviously prefer to even avoid 7 days at home quarantine. So they're all gravitating towards these VTL flights, which only generally operate in one direction, except for South Korea, which will be 2-direction VTL, but because it's a unilateral move by Singapore, so it only operates from. So that also creates an imbalance. So you can take any flight you have there, which is easy to get, but then everybody has to get on those certain flights on the way back, and then of course that means that all these VTL flights are popular, while the other flights that are non-VTL are not popular. So it creates this imbalance. So it's very difficult for airlines to manage this. It's not really good for consumers. So it's bad for airlines, bad for consumers. And it's of course, if you look at what's happening elsewhere in the region, nobody's doing vaccinated travel lanes. Countries are generally opening up generally. So. They allow airlines to respond to demand. They're waiving quarantine, or they're, like Australia is waiving quarantine for New South Wales and Victoria on return, for all countries. Some do it for select countries, but maybe only have 2 groups rather than 4 groups, or actually Singapore kind of has 5 groups, because if you look at category 2, there's VTL, non-VTL, which is treated differently. So you have 5 groups, while most of the countries have 2 groups or 0 groups. It's just every country is treated equally. There's a lot of extra layers to this thing, and I mean, I understand why Singapore has done it, but I just think that time will come when, hopefully pretty soon, where they'll kind of do what the other countries are doing and open up in a more general way, with a simplified system where people can enter quarantine free from a bunch of countries, and maybe have a simplified list where with two categories rather than 5 or 4 categories. So I think that will happen eventually. But in the interim, I think they will kind of keep this system in place, and maybe they'll add a few more countries to the VTL, and maybe add to the cap as well, which at least will alleviate some of the strain, in terms of providing more supply to meet the demand for the peak periods. So I think that kind of be the interim step, kind of as we look towards December, that there'll be maybe an increase in the VTL. Even though I would like to see it go away entirely, I just don't think it's realistic for them to kind of drop it just the way that the government usually works. So I'm hoping for an increase, followed by a suspension, and moving to a different system by early next year, hopefully. And I think what's happening regionally is very important. I think Singapore will pay attention to what's happening in other countries. It's not necessarily relevant what's happened in Europe or North America, the kind of the Big Bang kind of Freedom Day or whatever opening, but I think it's important to look at what's happening elsewhere around here, and because Singapore will have to be competitive ultimately with the other destinations in the region. And I think the reopening, it's becoming clear every day now with more announcements that reopening in the Asia Pacific region is not about vaccinated travel lanes, but it's not about what's happening in Europe or the US. It's more kind of middle ground. It's a little bit more conservative. So it's something that's makes sense, I think, and I think the best examples will win out, and the VTL is not a best example in my opinion.
Okay, great. That's all the questions I have for you, Brendan. Thank you so much for sharing with us your insights.
Okay, thank you so much, Karen, and great participating in the show, and I hope to be back in the future.
Definitely. Now, to everyone, past and future episodes of TTG Conversations, 5 questions can be found on the TTG YouTube channel. So meanwhile, take care, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next episode. Goodbye.